There we go. So welcome to our keynote address today by Professor William Cockerham, who will deliver his talk, COVID-19 and the Other Half of the Story, the Social. A bio here, William C. Cockerham is Distinguished Professor and Chair Emeritus of Sociology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and Research Scholar of Sociology at the College of William and Mary. He is past President of the Research Committee on Health Sociology of the International Sociological Association and author or editor of 20 books and several chapters in academic journal articles. Additionally, he has served in editorial positions for the American Sociological Review, Journal of Health and Social Behavior, Mental Health and Society, and Social Currents, among others. His most recent books with Routledge include Sociological Theories of Health and Illness in 2021, Sociology of Mental Disorder, now in its 11th edition, also in 2021, The COVID-19 Reader, What the Science Says About the Social, in 2021, and Medical Sociology, now in its 15th edition. Now, to add to that bio, I just want to say that I've had the privilege of working with Professor Cockerham before. I was managing editor of an encyclopedia where he was the lead co-editor, the Encyclopedia of Health, Illness, Behavior, and Society for Wiley. And in addition to the fantastic level of his scholarship, he's just an all-around good guy, as they say. So I'm very happy to have him with us. I'm very honored to have him with us, and I'm really looking forward to his talk. So, Professor Cockerham? Oops, hang on, we have you on mute here. Let's see. There we go. Did you get a?
I did. Okay.
There we go. There we go.
Finally. Okay, good.
Hi.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I've enjoyed the presentation so far, and I'd hope to add something to it as well, to the discussions that have been held so far. My topic today is to look at the social side of this pandemic, but in doing so, I'm going to focus on the social causes, because my interest is in what caused COVID-19 to be this gigantic and deadly disruptor of our everyday lives. Because it's not just biological. That is, the pandemic obviously is also social. And so the question I ask myself is, how did the social begin? What was it? Where do we start to find out where the social enters into interaction with the biological, so that in the future we don't have to experience this again as a society, that we're going to be more astute, hopefully in the future, in our ability to cope with and to prevent a pandemic of this nature taking place. And in order to do that, we've got to see how they start. And so what I'd like to do for the time I have, at least the next few minutes, is talk about the social, where it began and what caused it. And in many ways, what I have to say probably involves more questions than answers, but nonetheless, at the start, I believe in uncovering the social facets of the social causes of the pandemic. And to begin, I guess at the earliest point, you can go back to urbanization, certainly globalization, climate change, which have over time brought human beings into closer contact with animals. Because many of the pandemics, literally we've had a parade of either epidemics and or pandemics for, well, ever since the latter part of the 1970s. It began with HIV/AIDS. AIDS had a connection in Africa originally with chimpanzees. We've had several various avian flus related to chickens and birds. The West Nile came from mosquitoes. SARS came from civet cats and began with bats and was transmitted to civet cats. MERS followed on. MERS, of course, again originated with bats, but was transmitted to camels who passed it on to people in the Middle East. Ebola began with bats and in bat caves. Zika began with mosquitoes. So we've had this continual parade of infectious diseases since the late 1970s, one after another, not necessarily every year, but every few years we get a new one. And then all of a sudden we got the big one, COVID-19. So it's important, I think, to go back and as I said, to look at the social causes of COVID-19. And one of the pandemics that's instructive, of course, is SARS. SARS is, as all of you I'm sure know, is a coronavirus. It originated in the bat caves. It came from China. It was first located in a wet market, and it kills roughly 8,000 people, mostly in China, but also in Vietnam, and it carried all the way to Toronto, Canada, where it stopped, where it disappeared. Interestingly enough, there were warnings at that time. Michael Osterholm, a leading epidemiologist, has an excellent article on this where he talks about how this could be a precursor to something deadly coming in the future, or SARS itself may return. We need to be prepared for it. And he mentioned several ways to prepare for it in terms of looking for vaccines and stockpiling protective equipment and so on and so on. Of course, really, this wasn't done. None of it was done. Very little of it was done. But nonetheless, it was a sort of a shot across the bow as a warning of what could come in the future that did in fact come, as a prediction certainly was true. But what about COVID-19? Well, we probably will never, ever really know exactly what caused COVID-19. But there are some pretty good ideas. And if we look at the literature, including several Chinese studies that were published, COVID-19 originates in bats. It passes apparently to pangolins, which are anteater-like creatures. Although that's a big question mark. That's not clear at all that that's what happened. But the genome in pangolins for COVID-19 is very similar to that found in bats, and also very similar to that found in humans. So they're probably the best candidate for passing it on. Well, how does a disease leap from an animal like that to a human being? Well, this is where the social begins, because clearly, as most of you know, the origin of the disease, or the location of the disease, initial location, is thought to be the Hunan wholesale seafood market, or Wuhan, China. Now, there's again more controversy about whether or not the pandemic actually expanded from the market. It could have come from somebody else. It could have come from, or it could come from another source. But nonetheless, that's a primary candidate that currently exists as far as a geographical location for the beginning of the pandemic. And some of the evidence that supports this is that of the first 41 candidates identified with COVID-19, 27 of them were related to the market. That is, they either worked in the market, or they had purchased food in the market, or they were food handlers, or they had some direct connection to that particular seafood market. The first patient, at least what is thought to be patient zero, was a 55-year-old farmer in the area of the market. So as I said, the social begins here, but what causes the social to be a cause? That's what is the link between catching the virus and people? Well, there's actually, I came across an interesting article by Zong et al. It's in an agricultural journal, Agriculture and Human Values. And it was done it was published in 2018. I think the work on it was actually done in 2017. But it describes Chinese wet markets and talks about the key features such as wet markets is freshness. And it's a desire in Chinese culture for hyper fresh food, and also for unusual foods, such as snakes and turtles and civet cats and bamboo rats and pangolins and all kinds of creatures, and also medicines from these animals, because it's believed that the freshness is best achieved by eating something that's been recently killed. And the same for the medicines that come from these animals, because it's thought that the immediacy of the consumption is related to the extent of the vitality that the animal passes on to the person. And also affects the flavor of the food itself. That is, only the freshest possible food is believed to have the most or the greatest natural flavor. So wet markets have been popular in China. They do have supermarkets, but wet markets are usually established or located next to neighborhoods with many people. That's where they go for their fresh food, and they're popular for a number of reasons. For one of them is, although this food tend to be fresh, but it's the most significant source of fresh food. I mean, you can pick out what you want to eat, and it's slaughtered in front of you, and then you can take it home and you can consume it. Typically, shopping, when you shop in these kinds of markets, you only buy food you only need to keep on hand for 24 hours before you consume it. That is, you don't freeze it, for example. There tends to be an aversion to many customers in Chinese wet markets to the non-fresh foods, that is canned foods or frozen foods, because they're thought to be stale. And they can be, as all of us know. Not particularly good in terms of flavor, or at least they do lose flavor. But another particular feature of such markets is the sensory experience. Is the noise, the smells, the liveliness, the interaction with other people, the ability to assess freshness on site by looking at the food that you consume. You're able to participate in a social network with vendors who you often know. You've met, you know them over the years. Other customers you see, friends, neighbors getting together. So there's a lively social aspect to engaging in food purchasing, in a wet market that is in many ways unique to that particular locale. So it's an attractive place to buy food. But on the other hand, they're not necessarily very hygienic places. Animals are kept in cages as they live there in cages. They sleep in cages, they defecate in cages, they urinate, copulate, slaughtered, taken out of cages and slaughtered on the spot, and cleaned and processed and best for food, and stuff gets all over the floor. That's why they're called wet markets. The term comes from hosing down the market at some point to clean it, to wash all the debris away. And if you see photographs of wet markets occasionally on the floors, you'll see basically what amounts to garbage. They have pungent smells. It may be attractive to some, to other people that may not necessarily be attractive, but they're not very hygienic places. There's a book by Sonia Shaw's published in 2010 called Pandemic. She went to a wet market after the SARS pandemic, and she describes her experience along the lines that I've just mentioned, in terms of the lack of what we'll call proper sanitation. But another feature which brings the social into play is, in addition to the freshness of the food, is that of its exotic nature, because there is in traditional Chinese culture a desire for food delicacies. And this includes a demand for what is called wild beast food. It's a luxury. They tend to be expensive. They are prized because it's believed that the foods that are consumed, that these foods from these exotic animals can be passed on to the individual. There's a snake wine, for example, that's made from marinating poisonous snakes and alcohol and herbs and spices and made into a wine. And if you drink it, it's supposed to make you feel very vital. I suppose it probably would if it's based from marinated poisonous snake, but nonetheless, I wouldn't want to drink it, but some people do because they feel better. At least they think they do. Whether it's a psychological feeling or there is in fact a physiological one, or both, is part of the story as well, because of the thrill, the excitement, and of eating these unusual foods. What about pangolins? Are they very good? I honestly don't know and never will. But on the other hand, I have read about them and I've read about cooking them and eating them. And apparently it takes a certain skill to cook them, and also you might want to serve them with a sauce. And they're not known for being particularly good or delicious, but their attraction is that they're rare and they're exotic. And so, again, we have the social entering into causal, or providing a causal basis for a pandemic. We have the unhygienic wet markets, and then we have, the attraction of crowds and people to these markets because of the types of food that are available there and really are not available anyplace else. So this brings us then to once people become infected in this kind of environment and milieu, what was the next social element? Well, the next social element that enters into this is the Wuhan civil government, because we find that in looking at this early literature, people began to becoming sick in Wuhan from a new form of pneumonia. Some thought it was SARS. It began coming to the attention of medical personnel who were asked to treat people with these problems. Many of them started sounding an alert, at least to their friends and colleagues. There's a particular example in Wuhan of an ophthalmologist. His last name was Li, L-I, Li Wanglang. So one of the true heroes of the pandemic. He was treating a patient for glaucoma. He noticed the patient's symptoms. He thought it was MERS. He started alerting some of his colleagues that he'd gone to medical school with about this possibility. He was arrested, he and his colleagues were arrested for rumor mongering, and he had to sign a statement before his release saying that he made it up, that it really wasn't true. So a second social element that is of critical importance here is the suppression of information about the pandemic in Wuhan. Local officials were concerned that it would reflect, that as the existence of a pandemic would reflect badly on them. Now, the Chinese central government, after the SARS epidemic, had set up a computerized alert system. An alert system which is designed to notify health authorities in Beijing of a pandemic breaking out in any part of the country, and do so rather quickly. However, Wuhan was silent. There was no alert. This is because the local officials did not want to be perceived as having a pandemic on their hands or doing a bad job. So what they did was they decreed that all information should come to them from local health authorities to the local officials only. And in the meantime, they should do everything to try to stamp out the pandemic. So again, more time is lost. First hospitalized patient shows up in mid-November in 2019. It wasn't until December 30th, 2019, that we find a whistleblower releases the documents online to the central government, on which they become for the first time, as on December 31st, that there is indeed a pandemic going on in Wuhan. On December 31st, the local officials finally released an report about the pandemic, and they indicated that there was no human-human transmission, and this went to the WHO, and the WHO repeated the same story because they essentially repeated what they were told. There's no human-to-human transmission, which of course we know now was wrong, exceedingly wrong. It wasn't until later in January that was reversed, and in the meantime, you've got 40,000 some odd people have traveled from Wuhan throughout the world. They went to the Middle East, particularly to Iran. They went to Italy. They went to Germany. They went to certainly the United States. They went to Britain. So you have this global exodus of infected people from Wuhan to the rest of the world, while the information about the pandemic was being first of all suppressed and then investigated. So really it wasn't until January 23rd of 2020 until travel ban was instigated and begun in Wuhan. So there are social causes here that need to be identified and I think certainly investigated further, and we need to, I think, develop more detail so that in the future a pandemic like this can be stopped in its tracks. Now, the Chinese did a relatively good job once they recognized the pandemic was serious. They had a draconian crackdown. People were pushed around on the street for not wearing masks or not staying in their homes. And some people had their doors locked, or in one case, I saw on television had doors welded, and they were able at first. They were able to curtail the pandemic eventually. Now, to the degree to which they've or been successful is not really clear, because the number of deaths, for example, in China hasn't really changed since last spring. But nonetheless, it does appear that the pandemic has eased considerably in China, and is now spread, of course, throughout the world. And the latest figures are, what, 3 million people have it, and well, it's 3 million deaths, to be clear. The social still remains important, because one of the most effective means, of course, combating it is social distancing and stay at home and lockdowns. And there are some critical social variables that are involved in the pandemic. Age is in particular. The older you are, the more likely you are to get it and die from it. Race is a critical variable, as we've learned from one of the sessions again this morning, and as we know how racial minorities suffer disproportionately from COVID. Gender is important, because gender, we find that women are slightly more likely to be infected from COVID than men, but men are slightly more likely to die from it. And of course, as sociologists, I'm particularly interested in social class, and there really have not been studies of social class to date that are thorough. In fact, to be honest, I haven't seen any, but we will see them. But the answer on studying social class is obvious. The lower you are the class structure, the more likely you are to suffer from COVID and die from it. If you look at the history of pandemic, it's always the lower class that gets the worst of everything, just like they do in everything else that has to do with health. So there's a considerably more we need to know about the pandemic from a social perspective, and the new questions emerge all the time. For example, we now find that the most deaths from COVID-19 are in the United States, in Brazil, and in Mexico. Every one of those countries is clearly in the Western Hemisphere. So what is there about the Western Hemisphere that's causing the most deaths? You know, I don't know, but I think it's certainly a research question that's worth looking at. So more time needs to be spent on the social, and we need to further develop, we need to develop our theories, and we need to develop our literature much more extensively than we've been able to do up to the current time. But it takes time to gather data of this nature and to come to a full sociological understanding of the processes that we are now experiencing. So I'll stop and open it up for questions.
Great, thank you for that. I really enjoyed that. It was very informative. I know I've got questions of my own, but I just need to change the settings here so folks can again chat there. Folks have questions, you can either raise your hand and I can unmute you, or feel free to type it into the chat. Maybe while other folks are thinking of their questions, let me start off with one. So I was doing a lot of thinking while you were talking about what makes eating a certain animal unusual or different. The first thing that pops to my mind actually was my father-in-law just shared a video on WhatsApp, I think it was last night, of him buying a lobster at the grocery store, which was horrifying to me because, you know, he's shaking the claw and the thing's alive, and I'm horrified by all this. And to me, I don't eat lobster. It seems very unusual to go to a grocery store and buy a living animal. Having lived in different places throughout the world, it's something I've noticed that, or I knew anyway, I guess, that in some cultures, certain foods or eating certain animals is acceptable, while in others it isn't. Where I live now in Kazakhstan, for example, eating horse is considered normal. And that's something that took my mind a little bit of time to get my head around. Certainly for some people, what I find normal of eating cows is clearly a great offense to over 1 billion people on the planet. So I wonder if we classify these diseases in particular ways when they come from animals that we in the West don't eat, that we with global power don't eat. And we tend to view differently diseases that come from animals like cows or chickens. And I just kind of wondered your thoughts sort of on general reflections on that. And also perhaps if you think it would be different if China were sort of the dominant global power, as it's likely to be. Would the same deal have been made out of the animal origins of this, do you think?
That's an interesting question, Michael. I mean, I can understand, you know, probably all of us at some point, it depends on where we may have something to eat that you don't normally eat. It might be rare and so forth. I know I was in Nairobi, Africa, and there's a restaurant there called the Carnivore, and you could get hippo and crocodiles and whatever, and it's just kind of interesting sort of try it. It's not anything you really want to eat, you know, for a steady diet. But they had beef, the beef was terrible. But it's the connected, what I sort of sense about this, it's a connection between, it's not just, it's eating the exotic, but it's being able to inhale, I don't know, inhale is not the right word, but it's being able to acquire the animal's physical vitality in nature, in your own physical body, so that you feel stronger, more powerful, maybe faster, you know, I don't know, more sexy, more exciting, just more vital as a person because you've done this sort of thing. And I don't think in Western culture we do much of that. Maybe we do, but I think it's more prominent in Chinese culture. And it's because it's, you know, because the cost, because the rarity, there's a certain amount of status being associated with it. And it's perhaps got increased in recent years because as the Chinese economy has certainly raised standards of living in China and increased the, you know, income and for some and for many who have, you know, been able to do well in the, you know, state capitalist economy. So I think it's more sort of just the attraction of the unusual, doing something unusual that's different. Now, if China was the dominant world power, that's really an interesting question. Will we have this problem? If China had cracked down quicker on the virus, perhaps we wouldn't have this problem. Perhaps it might not have been, simply because autocratic governments are able to marshal resources and control behavior much more effectively than democratic societies, particularly societies that are kind of messy in their politics. And but I honestly don't know. That is an intriguing question. If their former government, if their style was worldwide or close to it, then perhaps the pandemic might have been suppressed right away. I don't want to make this an advertisement for that former government, because I really don't, not in the least, but it is an interesting question to pursue. Would they be criticized as much by the West if they were a dominant world power? Probably not. Although it's going to be interesting, at least to me, as to what happens next after the pandemic ends. How is China going to be viewed by the rest of the world? Because certainly there's been a lot of suffering. And there has also been not only suffering and death, but there has also been, as we know, serious economic problems, throughout the world, and they're ongoing. And where do you point for that? One would think that there'd be some demand for better measures in China to control wet markets, where we see coronaviruses mutating out of, or at least emerging out of. Now, how successful that's going to be, I really have no idea. The World Health Organization on March 20th, March. Actually, I've got it right here. So it's 26th of March. They listed their recommendations to reduce risk of transmission of emerging pathogens from animals to humans in live animal markets. And basically, what they say is if you go there, you need to wash your hands, and you need to be careful. You need to avoid unhygienic conditions. Don't buy animals that look like they might be sick. Stay away from them. And then they have a message from the vendors saying, don't serve sick animals. Don't have them there. Keep your place clean. It's all good advice, but there's no teeth in it. It's basically try to be clean. So I just wondered if there's going to be a more stringent demand, or if the Chinese government itself will take it upon itself to try to prevent these types of locales from becoming the social centers of future pandemics.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's a long future in this kind of research and what's happened, and especially even after the pandemic is over, what were the responses to it and the long-term consequences? So
yes,
we've got many more books to write, I think. Let me move to some questions here in the chat. I see Uljas asked, thank you very much, Dr. Cockerham. Have you heard about the Bhutan case, and what do you think about it? Are you familiar with, let me see if I can unmute Uljas here, and maybe you can explain to us what the Bhutan case is, because I'm not sure I know.
Hello, can you hear me?
Uljas, are you there? We can hear you now, Uljas.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Dr. Cockerham. It was an interesting talk that you gave. So by Bhutan case, I mean the fact that they vaccinated almost the whole population. They vaccinated around 500,000 people, I believe, just today. So what do you think about it? How would you say they reached this goal to make a greater set of the population get vaccinated?
Well, it would sound to me like they've probably done a better job than most other places I'm aware of. The vaccination process I know in the United States has been very uneven, although we're beginning to get there. think about 25% of the population now has been fully vaccinated. But I wasn't aware of what was going on in Bhutan at all. Unfortunately, our news services here only carry news about the United States, and you have to go to someplace like BBC to get the more international news, unless there's some big disaster someplace. But that's incredible that they've been able to accomplish that. Do you know what vaccine they used?
I'm not sure. Maybe AstraZeneca, I think. It was AstraZeneca,
Okay.
probably.
Okay, well, that's interesting.
Yeah,
That's a
I
good
think
question. I'll look into that.
Maybe. Yeah, I can send the link. I think there is a New York Times article. I can.
Okay, good. Thank you.
I think we could have a whole session. In fact, maybe it's an idea for the fall just on this question of vaccines. That's one that's going to become critical
Sure.
in the rollouts, the politics, and that's an issue that's definitely not going away anytime soon.
No, not at all.
I think we have a question here from Umut, I think is how you pronounce it. How can the WHO, with many experts, be wrong about the main issue about any disease, transmissibility from human to human? Let me unmute you here, Umut, in case you want to elaborate on that.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Actually, it is like a comment, in any case, the most important question is it transmissible from human to human, because it has the potential to be endemic or pandemic, something like that. As our professor said before, I read about the background story, how they stop the rumors in China. And I am just recovering from Corona, by the way, and I feel awful. I feel disabled. I have many neurological symptoms still going on. I have a brain fog, they say, and I am just trying to cope with my work and study. It's awful, and there are lots of uncertainty. So to prevent something happening again, as our professor said, in 2 years or in a period, something like that, SARS, MERS, COVID, of course, it will continue. The most important thing, I guess, is to prevent, not socio-economic interventions. We are talking about other issues, but the most important thing, I think, it's to prevent to be a global pandemic. So I want to learn about our professor's thoughts about that, how to prevent something like that again.
Okay, so I think the question is sort of how could we prevent something like this in the future, maybe?
I think that we need to close down wet markets, or at least there needs to be a capability to ensure that the features of such markets that result in the transmission of infectious diseases is stopped. The source of these markets, or these markets as a source, need to be removed so that we don't have this kind of disease again. I think it's difficult in some ways to enforce that in a country like China, where so many people use such markets and participate in such markets. But I think that it's incumbent on China's government really to take measures to make sure this doesn't happen again, and to pay more attention to health inspections and avoid bribery by vendors, and cut down on smuggling of endangered animals, since many of these animals that are featured, or at least some of them are in fact endangered species, which makes them even more rare, more costly, and more desirable as a food. And ultimately, if you take a look at the transmission process, it begins with bats. Seems to me we need to do something about the bat population. I don't mean to eradicate them, but to see if there's a way to prevent bats from infecting animals that infect people. They're developing a really nasty reputation, I think, for the species for causing infections and to kill animals and people in great numbers. And so there's a lot of work to be done. It's also going to be interesting to see, I think, what the long-term effects are on society after this. Are there going to be long-term effects? Are we going to continue social distancing? Are people going to continue to work from home? Are we going to have telemedicine, for example? Is that going to be more common? We're going to visit our doctors, over our computers now, as opposed to the past, more so. What's going to happen to forms of leisure? Are certain forms of leisure going to disappear, like say movie theaters? That's going to be gone, and then we're going to watch movies at home through streaming if we want to go to the movies. There's a lot of unanswered questions right now.
I think that actually dovetails nicely onto the next question here from Alejandro. I'm going to unmute him, and Alejandro, maybe you can ask it yourself.
Thank you, Professor Cockerham. My question has to do how you feel about how the social is going to shape this period that is coming up now, in which more and more people get vaccinated, and some of the social norms that have emerged during the pandemic, like social distancing, wearing a mask, etc., are going to start fading as a social consensus. And despite that, many people are going to still be at risk because they won't be vaccinated or because they have conditions, etc. No? So my question would be, to what extent do you think in that transition period that society as a whole will be able to see the risks of abandoning those social conventions that came up during the pandemic and have some kind of social solidarity coming up again as we see what are the consequences of this reckless behavior in terms of deaths, etc.?
That is a really good question. It's something that I've often thought about. You're going to have a certain portion of the population is going to just say whoopee and go out and just resume their lives as they were. I mean, you can see that now when you look at things like spring break in the United States, where all these kids flock to the beach and drink and go out in the streets and have it in bars and basically are there to have fun. The pandemic's over, so let's go have a good time. And of course, that's conducive to further transmission of COVID. One way to consider it is to look back at the Spanish flu of 1918. There was a worldwide pandemic and killed millions of people. And ask yourself, well, what happened after that? Did people go back to normal? They did. After a few years, life pretty much resumed as it had been before. And I suspect that is going to be the way it will be with this one as well. The majority of people vaccinated, and perhaps the vaccines are being spreading over the world, although it looks like it's going to take up until 2023 for the entire world to get vaccinated, if you look at WHO statistics. Some of the African countries being the last to be vaccinated in their entirety. But over time, social life is likely to return to normal, although interestingly enough, there may be some lasting effects. There may be more people may work at home than previously. But are there still going to be concerts? Are there still going to be sporting events that are going to attract people? Are people still going to go out socially at restaurants and bars? Particularly over time, as temporal distance emerges from the pandemic, as we get further and further away from the end of the pandemic, Is life going to return to normal? It probably is, to a large extent. There may be a few things that remain, but I don't think there's going to be a massive social change as a result of our experiences. If anything, there may be a desire to come closer together as families see other family members and people get out and simply celebrate, try to live a life that involves intense social contact. Could be wrong, and perhaps I am, but I think over time it will be a situation where life returns to fairly normal. Hey, Mike, if you can hear me, we can't hear you. Nope.
How about now?
Now, okay, good.
Okay. It's always something with Zoom. The one thing I'm looking forward to is getting away from Zoom. I have to, and thanks everyone for being here, by the way, but I'd rather see you in person. Okay, so I'm back now. Sorry, Sarah, were you able to hear Sarah?
No.
No, but
Okay, there we go.
can you hear me now?
We can hear you now, yeah.
So I had a question. This relates to something you said in your talk about the numbers in the West, deaths being higher in Mexico, Brazil, and the US. And I just wanted to share an experience because I've experienced two very different contexts during the pandemic. One is the UAE and the other is Canada. And I noticed a lot of differences when I looked at signage in public spaces. There are lots of bottom-up signs in Canada about mask resistance and the effects of social distancing on mental health. And people feel they can say that or post these signs in public spaces. But in the UAE, it's very rare to see that. And UAE numbers, considering deaths and also hospitalized numbers are much lower. So I just sort of wondered if that, I mean, I'm sure we know that that's a factor, but I'd like you to talk a little more about that if you could.
Well, as to why we have more of it, why we have more deaths in those three countries, I hadn't really thought about the public expression yet, but there are some other variables, such as the leaders of each of those countries, at least the national leader, did not take it as seriously as warranted. We also have problems of obesity, perhaps may enter into this in a way that hasn't been thought of yet in this particular countries. There's also the attitudes about individualism and being, having a right to do what you want to do without having the government tell you what to do, which some people resent, and that affects probably Canada as well as I would think the United States. But maybe there's some other factors, maybe climate, the flawed response of public health systems in those three countries is likely also to play a factor, but I don't really have an answer, but I think the question's out there, and as to why these three countries, why did more people die here than die somewhere else? Die in China, die in Sweden, die in Poland, die in Nigeria. I'm curious about that. You know, why these three? Why not some other three? What's the common denominator, the common link that ties them each together in such a way that has this terrible result?
Thank you.
Our next question here comes from Bexat. So Bexat, let me go ahead and unmute you so you can ask it.
Thank you for your lecture, Professor. My question is, so if we take the case of China, will those cultural eating habits change after the pandemics? Maybe in some aspects, either voluntarily by the choice of majority or by the government's decision, because the government in China is strong, yeah. So, and also after experiencing such a terrible time, does the world public have a right to criticize certain eating habits? Yes, because I mean, now we have understanding that I mean, we cannot criticize social things, yes, because we are all different. All nations, they have certain cultures, certain norms, and you cannot go to your neighbor's garden and tell them how to live, yeah, basically. But maybe after experiencing this, maybe we'll have a certain consensus, like because I'm sure, like even some people in China in those markets, I mean, if you let them say like you either don't eat snakes in the alcohol, yeah, marinated, or you don't have such coronaviruses again, and probably they will choose not to eat snakes, yeah, I mean. And so what's your opinion on this? Thank you.
Well, I think people will speak up more, and by people I also mean governments, because it's the social behaviors that have stimulated the expansion or the transmission of COVID, I think it caused us all to develop greater concern about health, not just of our health, but health generally, health throughout the world. And so I'd like to think that just common sense would put an end to some of these cultural habits, but as we all are experienced human beings, we know that people don't always do what appears to be practical. You get common sense. So I do think we're going to see a sort of a change in perhaps in attitudes from you know, one time if you were health was whether or not you were healthy, that was essentially you know, your own individual situation, and that's just the way it was. You were either healthy or you weren't healthy. That's just how life had turned out for you. To the second stage of where you're concerned about trying to maintaining your health as living a healthy lifestyle. And now it looks like we may be hopefully moving towards a step in which we're concerned about everybody being healthy, not just us, and extending our focus about health away from ourselves as individuals to having a more collective sense of responsibility. So I hope it answers your question, but that's probably the best I can do at the moment.
I hope that's true as well. I hope that's spot on. There's also a comment in the chat here from Patricia. So I'm going to unmute you, Patricia. I realize it wasn't a question, but I think it's a really interesting point. So maybe we can get some feedback on it. I'll go ahead and unmute you.
Okay.
All right, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay.
How are you doing?
Oh, good. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Ryan, and thank you, Dr. Cockerham. It's really nice to see you again. I'll shout out to Dr. Cockerham, hired me straight out of graduate school many years ago. So we're old friends.
That's true.
Yeah, what I was thinking was just, so when we think about how the transmission occurred in cities, it makes a lot of sense. You know, there's public transportation, there are restaurants, there's the wet markets and so on. We can easily see, you know, apartment buildings, we can easily see how it happened. It just blows my mind, honestly, how it ended up in places like rural Mississippi, for instance. how did it travel so far across the world and into these rural areas? So I think it'd be interesting to look at across the world, different rural areas, and see how did the transmission occur in these different places. So again, more of a comment than a question, but I think we've learned about social behavior.
Actually, that's a really good question. I don't have a ready answer for it, but the example you pointed out is very appropriate. It's also the state of West Virginia, which tends to be rural, and certainly they got it there, but they're also able to be one of the better states in terms of coping with it. But rurality, I think, that's another important question because it did spread, did go.
It did.
Yeah. Although we have a county near where I live now, Surrey County, it's across the James River. The COVID pretty much missed them, but the county doesn't have a lot of people, and they did have it, but the number of cases and the number, I think only 2 people have died in the entire county since the pandemic hit this part of the country. So, so there are places that just pass by.
That'd be
there are other
interesting.
rural areas that did. Go ahead.
Sorry, that'd be interesting then to see across the world, maybe what were the missed places. And I think of it kind of like blue zones and the idea of, there's these areas in the world where certain factors emerge and people live for a very long time. Are there factors that emerge where it may be missed places in rural areas?
There may well be. There may well
Yeah.
be. That's a good question.
Well, thank you.
Just thinking about that, if I can pitch in my own 2 cents here, I happen to be originally from a very small town in Indiana, about 500 people. So it's about as small as you can get and still stay on the map. And they've kind of missed it, but that area, the county itself has been pretty heavily infected. And the association in my mind anyway is that there's some relationship with politics. Because while you might be in more rural areas and perhaps greater social distancing, we know that people living in rural areas are more likely to be conservative. We know that conservatives are less likely to be wearing masks. I think that there's maybe some of those kinds of associations where rural areas are interesting geographically, but it might be some of these more social aspects that are tying on top of that.
Good point. Yeah, Surrey County still has Trump signs up, so it may be a factor.
I think we're hitting up to about our hour time now. I don't want to keep anybody longer and exhausted. I'm sure some of us are just waking up for the day, I suppose. Others of us, I see some of my colleagues here from Kazakhstan are probably about ready to turn in. But I do want to thank Professor Cockerham for being with us today. That was excellent. I really enjoyed it. I want to thank everybody for coming to the talk. Those were also really good questions. I know I've been sitting here sketching notes, and the first thing I'm going to do when this ends is sit down and sketch everything while it's still fresh in my mind. So really good ideas, really productive. Again, a special thanks to you, Professor Cockerham, for being with us. And
thank you. Appreciate it.
I hope everyone will be able to join us again tomorrow. We'll be starting at the same time. It's 2 p.m. London time, 9 a.m. New York time. You know what? It's on the agenda. The time zones are muddled in my head. It'll be the same place, same time tomorrow. So I look forward to seeing you all there. And thanks for joining us today.